Welcome back to my channel, Xyla here, and I have this really big problem that I'm hoping you guys can help with, and it is that my new shop is beautiful and wonderful and I love it, and it is way too clean. Okay, so I've been trying to come up with an excuse to build an instrument for a really long time. I realized at some point in the last couple of months that I don't need an excuse. I can just do it. So instead of making a really simple, like solid body base the way a normal person would, I decided to make my life really hard, and I designed this monstrosity.
This video was graciously sponsored by KiwiCo. More on them at the end of the video. I don't know why, but this design, pretty much down to every curve, popped into my head at a Jacob Collier concert where he was like sitting on a park bench playing the bass, and I really liked it, so here we are. Anyway, before I get copyright striked for that one, let's actually get started. So here I'm laser cutting out the templates for my first forms, and so these two curves are the interior curves of that shape that I designed. So I cut them out on the laser cutter, cleaned them up a little bit, and then traced them onto the plywood that I'll use to actually make the forms. Now what you're seeing here is a wild Xyla in the wild, exhibiting a common behavior called bandsaw laziness, and that is when you don't change the blade of your bandsaw from a resaw blade to the 1/4-inch blade that's sitting like 3 feet away, and as a result it takes forever to cut all these curves because you're lazy. Anyway, I eventually got that done and went to the classic masking tape and super glue trick to get a template onto a form. So once that was glued on, I just took it over to a trim router bit on my router table, and then I can just peel the template right off and keep going. And what keep going means is I'm gonna repeat that process over and over again, just gluing the now routed plywood to a piece that needs to be routed because I need this to be 2.5 inches thick. So that's 3 3/4-inch pieces of plywood glued together. And keep in mind, there's 4 of these that I'm doing, so it can take quite a while, but luckily I learned some magic tricks along the way. The avatar may be the master of all 4 elements, but can he bend wood? I think not. So I will teach you to become a woodbender. It's actually pretty simple. You just need to make a steam box. Okay, if you actually want to learn how to make a steam box, I ended up throwing together a video on my brandy new second channel. And so you can go watch it there. I'll link it down in the description below. Otherwise, we're gonna move on to the really important part of this, which is that I asked Twitter to name my brand new steam box as I was working on it.
All right, it's been an hour and the Twitter poll has ended, and obviously Steamy McSteambox won, but second place was Steambox Willie. And I think that's hilarious and also adorable. And because this is complete anarchy and there is no one here to physically stop me, I think I'm gonna do Steambox Willie. I even printed him out. And I'm gonna stick him on. All right, Steambox Willie is done.
And that means it's time to rip down some ash and test her out. Oh, and for thin strips like this, you need to use Fretboard. If you don't, I will call your mother and I will tell on you.
All right, I'm gonna brag for a second. That is like perfect. They are exactly the same width. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure that there are gonna be people watching this video who are better than me, but at least for me, no matter how many times I've steam bent something, it takes me a couple tries to figure out what the process is for this specific project. So I pretty much always get like double the amount of wood that I need because I know I'm gonna break a bunch of pieces. And the other thing that I've found is that, like, regardless of the wood you're using and the guide, like if you Google how long you should steam bend each type of wood, take that number and chuck it out and just steam it for as long as you can.
All right, it is day 2 of Steambox Willie. I came in at like 8:30 this morning and popped these pieces of wood in there, and then I went to the dentist and it's now noon. So let's see how it goes.
Okay, so the problem that I run into here is that the outside of the curves crack, and that's really hard to solve without a compression strap. And the problem is because this is S-shaped, I can't have a compression strap on both sides. So I decided to just cut my pieces a little thinner. This means that instead of doing one solid piece, I'm now going to do a Bentwood lamination, which in a lot of ways is actually just stronger and better. And because I'm gonna keep my pieces of wood matched up as close as I can, it's still gonna look like one solid piece of wood. When you're cutting really thin strips like this, be really, really careful, use push sticks, and use a Fretboard. So with the cut pieces lined back up all neatly, I just cut them down, and now I'm gonna bend them the exact same way. And for anyone new around here, how steam bending works is basically the steam softens lignin, which is, you can think of it like the glue that holds all the strands of cellulose that make up wood together. And so when it's soft, you can bend it, but then when it cools, the lignin rehardens. And once I had gotten both shorter pieces successfully bent after several attempts, I decided I was ready to go for the big outer piece. And not only that, I decided I was ready to go for the big outer piece as one really long piece of wood that wraps all the way around instead of two separate pieces. So I threw it in CAD, sent it to the laser cutter, and made a template the exact same way that I did the other ones. Also, and aside from voiceover Xyla of the future, if any of you are crazy enough to want to try this yourself, I've listed all of these templates on eBay because honestly, I'm cleaning up and I want them out of my shop. I'll drop a link in the description. And then with my 3 sheets laminated together and routed, I went to the hole saw and just took out big chunks, and the idea here is I need something to clamp to. And with the form ready for something to wrap around it, it was time to cut down the strips for the main section of the base.
You know what's funny? Does anyone remember this moment?
Oh, tripped the breaker!
Someday I'll have a real shop. Please support me on Patreon. That's all I ask.
Because now I have a real shop and I'm still blowing the breaker. On the bright side, I have now determined where on my completely unmarked electrical panel the front of the garage is.
Anyway, with that little adventure behind us, which took like an hour for the record, I was able to finish cutting down my strips and move on to bending. I pondered for a while on how I was going to secure this mold to any kind of surface, and then I finally decided to disassemble a couple T-track clamps and repurpose them by drilling 2 holes down the middle of the form, like such. And with the form ready to go, it was time for the scariest part of this whole project thus far, bending the like 5-foot long piece of ash. And this was really difficult. The ash I had had steaming for probably 8 hours or so. It was most of the day. And then it was still like a full body. I was actually sore the next day from doing this. And you can see in some spots me using a clamp to clamp the other clamps because it was so difficult to get all that tension.
Ah, I did it. Okay, check this out. My hands are throbbing. My body hurts. This was like a ton of physical labor. There's a couple imperfections, but those will come out in the wash. Those will get fixed in the glue up. So for the most part, we have the shape of our base. Ah! Okay, I'm going to bed. Bye.
And with everything successfully bent, it was just time to glue all the laminations together. And since everyone always asks about glue, I'm just using normal wood glue. It's the most invisible option for a use case like this. Once there was a super generous coat on all faces, I stacked it all back up and popped it back in the clamp and back in the vise. And so I want it to get glued together in the mold as well so that it is like a perfect shape. And since the vise was being taken by the other one when I glued the shorter one up, I decided to just clamp it directly onto one half, and that was fine. And the big glue up was exactly the same, just bigger. And honestly, a little more satisfying. And this is one of those things that can be easy to forget, but when you're gluing things up, remember to masking tape off your forms. Otherwise, you'll have one object at the end.
All right, so I got this wildly beautiful piece of purple heart for Christmas this year, and I'm thinking that it looks like a base, and it should be a base, but I've never worked with purple heart before. Wish me luck. I'm excited.
First things first, I cut my templates out on the laser cutter, and then I took the piece over to the bandsaw to cut it down to size. All right, I got a bone to pick with all of you who are watching this video who didn't warn me that Purple Heart is the worst wood ever. Why is it so bad? I don't care that you're watching this like 2 years after I posted this video. Someone should have told me that it's oily, it gets everywhere, it turns your snot purple, it dulls your blades, it breaks your bits, it tears out worse than like a gross crusty scab, and not only that, it smells like farts. God, what a scam. Man, I could have bent this ash with the steam coming out of my ears. I didn't realize it was so pent up in there. Anyway, it was time to trim the ash down and then move on to routing the Purple Heart. I hogged out the first chunk of material using a Forstner bit in my drill press, which is pretty normal, and then it was time to take a follow bit in my router to the template, which was actually my first time doing this, and it's incredibly nerve-wracking, and I learned some things, and I am by no means a perfect person, and this is Exhibit A. I was sort of torn on showing this, but I think it's really important to show that, like, I don't get everything right on my first try either. So if you screw something up, everything is fixable, and you should not worry about it at all. So anyway, I repeated the process through the pickup pockets. So there's the neck pickup and the bridge pickup.
All right, so I maybe had some hiccups with the neck pocket, but these pickup pockets look quite good.
And by some stroke of pure genius, I actually remembered to center punch the screw holes for the bridge before I took the template off. Amazing. And then with the template off, I could go in and deepen that neck pocket to its final depth. Next, I have to go in and make a pocket for the spoke wheel of the truss rod. So there's a couple different types of truss rods, which is how you adjust tension in the neck. And the one that I have has a small wheel at the bottom that you can kind of stick a poker in and adjust it on the fly. So this is a really easy way for players to be able to adjust the tension of the neck themselves without having to go to a luthier. But it does mean you have to carve out this little spot. And here we're also going to get a little glitch in the matrix. So you're not watching this in the chronological order that I was making it. I was basically working on all pieces concurrently, but in the edit it made no sense. So just pretend you didn't see that neck and that we haven't made it yet.
I had to slip up at the router and I nicked the side, so I've been carefully shaping this piece that's got a grain match to glue in there.
Now, some may call her bold and some may call her crazy, but after carefully catting out the entire base, I decided to just absolutely wing it on the cavity. So I just freehanded it in masking tape and then drilled thin pilot holes all the way through, and then the area where the pots are going to stick up through the top 1/4 inch of the wood, I went in with the size Forstner bit that fit those pots, and then on the back I used that same pilot hole to just drill like very large holes where the rest of the pot will fit. And it worked pretty well. No regrets, mostly. And then to make space for the rest of the electronics, I just went in and drilled some other holes. And so this is kind of what the back cavity ended up looking like, although I did connect those 2 holes and I don't think I got it on camera. And then I went in and I also, not only did I remember to center punch those screw holes, I remembered to drill them too. And with the main body of the base done, at least that center Purple Heart piece, I don't even know what to call it. It was time to give everything a preliminary sanding before I assembled it, because once it's assembled, it's way harder to sand. So I just went through, hit everything with some 120 and then some 220, and got to putting it together. I opted for a combo of screws and epoxy because I didn't really trust either one alone. So for each point where the ash meets the Purple Heart, I tried to get at least 1 screw in there, and then also epoxy the joint. And the epoxy also helps with just general gap filling because it's not perfect, but a little bit of ash sawdust mixed into the epoxy helped blend the two together really nicely. Now, one of the lessons I learned really early on, and yet I still had to just keep learning it over and over again, is that Purple Heart will eat your drill bits for breakfast and then wash it down with broken screws for lunch. So as you can see here, I pilot drilled and then drove the screw in like normal, and after I hammered in the plug, I realized that when screwing the screw in, it had actually shattered the screw inside. So I had to go in and do it again, and this time, and for all holes going forward, I realized that I have to drill the pilot hole a lot bigger in Purple Heart than any other wood. Also, you want to talk about plugs on hard mode? Angled plugs. Let me tell ya, it's a different beast. And with the inner pieces secured and on, I gave it a quick sand before attaching the outer one again, because it's easier to sand without that outer piece on yet. And then I used the exact same method for the long piece. And for epoxy, I am of course using Bottle Tote 4-minute epoxy. I will say, it's pretty satisfying to watch those plugs disappear. I laser cut the shape that I wanted for the back cavity cover plate out of the same ash that I used on the sides of the guitar so it'll match really nicely, and then I traced it on and freehand routed it. Although I did have to remove that screw head so that the router wouldn't hit it, which was kind of terrible, but we made it work. And then while I got really close with the router, I did go in and just do a little bit of cleanup work at the end with a Dremel, and then mostly a lot of cleanup work with my chisels. And even though it's a non-traditional design, I still wanted to go for the traditional wing shape of the bass, so I carved out the contours mostly with my Arbortech Power Carver and also a little bit of a belt sander and an orbital sander just to get that like really swoopy shape. And then I went in with my cutest little spindle sander head and sanded the wingtips flush. Next, I popped a roundover bit into my router and just went through and smoothed over all of the hard corners. And obviously I did my best, but with the inside corners I couldn't get there, so I did have to do those by hand. And then sanding and more sanding and more sanding. It hurts my soul how much sanding I have to edit out of videos because I don't think you guys realize how much sanding I do, or like appreciate the fact that I have wasted most of my 20s just sanding stuff. Oh, you thought I was done? Absolutely not. I am never done sanding. Psych. But this time I won't actually make you watch much of it. You're welcome. And then the last thing to do on the body before moving on to the neck is just drill the holes for the screws and the pockets for the ferrules that will hold the neck on. And somehow it's time to move on to the neck. So for the neck, I did the template very similarly that I did the body. I laser cut out of really thin MDF a template that I could use to make my template. I didn't want to go straight to a full template with a piece that had been cut in half. So I assembled it together and then used this to make my real template. And for anyone who thinks this is ridiculous or overkill, let me tell you that the piece of torrefied maple I'm about to make this neck out of was sent to me by StuMac, but was like a $300 piece of wood. So I wanted the most solid template that I could possibly have. Before I cut the neck out though, it's easier to route the channels for the truss rod and the carbon fiber stiffening rods ahead of time so that you can use an edge guide on the router. So I found the center line of the template and then found where I want it to sit on the wood, making sure that that center line is parallel to an edge so that I can use that edge glide. And then I went in and routed the channels and then I could cut it out. Also, a lot of you guys noticed it's been a couple months since my last upload, and this whole year, honestly, but the last couple months in particular have been really rough. I had a bunch of medical issues. I got COVID, and then my landlord tented my house for fumigation, and then it got burgled, and then I had more medical issues. So a huge thank you to my patrons for providing me with like the only job security that I have, and for honestly just getting me through the last couple months. So if you'd like to join my Patreon, it gets you access to my Discord, my monthly Patreon Zooms, and some other benefits like early videos and long cuts of videos. Anyway, getting off my little soapbox here, with all 3 channels routed, I squared up the ends of the ones for the carbon fiber stiffener rods with a small chisel, and then I was ready to head over to the bandsaw and just cut the whole thing out. To fit the truss rod, I just placed it into its channel and then sort of carefully penciled around the area where the spoke wheel interfered with the wood and took my chisels to it and made its own little pocket. Once it fit nice and snug, I glued my template back on and took it back over to the trim router for final shaping. And while I was over there, I thinned the headstock a little bit as well. Next, I mixed up some Total Boat 4-minute epoxy, and there is a code for, I think, 10% off down in my description below. And I used that to glue the carbon fiber stiffener rods in. And what these do is just give the neck some more strength. Basses and guitars, and honestly all string instruments, are under a huge amount of tension, and this will basically just help ease some of that from the wood. Once that was cured, I marked and then loosely cut out the ebony for the fingerboard. And I will admit to using a pre-slotted fingerboard. That's the only pre-made thing I used. And I had all good intention to use just an ebony blank. But with COVID and my production schedule shifting, I decided this would be easier and faster. I still fretted it myself, so shush. And while everything else on the fingerboard will get trim routed later, the little tongue that overhangs the body actually won't, so it was important to shape that correctly now. Before gluing the fingerboard on, it's important to mask off the area where the truss rod sits so you don't accidentally glue the truss rod to the fingerboard, and for this I used normal wood glue.
I totally forgot to move the camera. The gist is that I glued the fretboard on, and look how many nice clamps I have. Big happy hours. Anyway, I'm gonna go to bed. So I've had this really fun thing for the last couple weeks called COVID-19. I can tell I'm moving slower and I'm getting things done slower and I'm making decisions slower, which sucks. So I'm trying to be nice to myself. I don't like not operating at 100%.
With the glue very dry, I pulled all the clamps off and trim routed the fingerboard to the neck, and then it was time to mentally prepare myself for my workout of the day, the week actually, which is shaping the neck. I started by just carving a straight channel to the thickest point of the neck, and so this is going to be my reference on each side for all of the planing. And then I hand planed all of that material off. I did it all by hand, I swear. I don't know what this is. I deny it. I hand planed the whole thing. Yeah, bring this back. I did this. This was the whole time. Anyway, once it was meticulously hand planed down, I drew a center line, and then I bisected my center line, and then I drew kind of a midline down each side of the neck. And then using a hand plane for real this time, I took that angle off, and I kind of just did that all the way around the neck. And I genuinely only used a hand plane and a spoke shave and a little bit of a rasp shaping the neck because I didn't want a power tool to potentially dig a little bit too deep and expose one of the carbon fiber rods, or worse, the truss rod. And then once I was happy with the shape of the neck, it was time to tackle the headstock and the heel. And so I did both of those with a rasp. It was just easier to kind of go for the shape that I had in my head. And then while I was at it, I decided to drill the holes for the tuning pegs. And I thought the easiest way was just to print out my CAD model in proper sizing and then use an awl to transfer the holes over. And so I pilot drilled them with a skinny bit, and then I went in with the Forstner bit and drilled them out to size. And the pilot hole is important because you can't take the Forstner bit all the way through the wood, or you might risk tearing out the wood on the back. So you can only go in halfway from each side, so this is how you line it up. And because I like to make my life as difficult for myself as possible, I designed in this little cutout in the headstock. In the end, I'm really glad I did it, but it was a massive pain in the ass, so I basically had to take this little coping saw and carefully cut out the shape, and then sanding and filing inside of it was a nightmare. But we did it, and it looks cool, so yeah. For the fretboard inlays, I just drew X's to find the center of the little box that the inlay is going to go in, and then I center punched them, drilled them out, and CA glued the little pearl dots in. The side inlays were pretty much the same, except with this tiny little flimsy plastic rod that was very nerve-wracking to work with. To shape the fretboard, I used this 16-inch radius block from StewMac, and it's basically just got the radius of the fingerboard machined into it, which is so nice. So I started with 80 grit sandpaper, I believe, and then worked my way all the way to 1,000 grit. Remember when I said I spent my 20s sanding? Yup, this is what I meant. Imagine if you were the one doing this, except it wasn't at 10,000% speed. With the fingerboard surface super smooth and really nice, it was time to prep the slots for fretting. So I went through and carefully cleaned all the sawdust out of each slot, and then I used a refretting saw to open up the slots just a little bit more, particularly at the tops, so that the frets will hammer in really nicely. To hammer the frets in, I started by placing each fret gently over the slot and then hammering one side in and then hammering the other side in and then slowly working my way over the arch. And this works for two reasons. One is that the bottom of the fret you'll see has got barbs on it, so that will grab the wood really nicely. And the other is that the frets are pre-radiused to a radius that's a little bit tighter than the fingerboard itself. So once it's in, it kind of grabs in. And when I was done hammering the frets in, I took fret snips, which are basically diagonal cutters, except they sit perfectly flush to the edge of the material, and snipped all the ends of the frets. Once snipped, I took the StewMac fret leveling file, and for the record, StewMac sent me everything for this video, and also there are a bunch of affiliate links to all of the tools that they sent me down in the description below. So if you're curious, you're welcome to check that out. But I took the leveling file and I filed the ends and basically down to the wood, got it all super smooth, and once it was nice and smooth, I turned it 45 degrees and sort of angled the frets in a little bit as well. With the fretboard up at an angle, I dropped a little bit of black CA glue on each little gap where the fret meets the wood. And my goal there was basically visual. I just wanted to make that gap disappear. And then I used that same fret plane to just plane that glue right off. And now onto fretwork. So step 0 basically is to protect the wood because it's already finished. So I just went over it with masking tape, leaving just the frets exposed. And then now it's time to level the frets. So I went over each fret with a Sharpie and then hit it with that same radius tool. And the goal here is to get it to the point where just a tiny bit, like a tiny silver stripe, is on the top of each fret, because that means that it's pretty much level. And then using this little fret leveling gauge, I went through and individually checked and adjusted every single fret all the way down the fretboard. And once the frets were all level, they have little flat tops, so I went over and Sharpied them again, and now this time I'm gonna go over each one with this little Z-shaped file and round the frets over. So before, while I was trying to get just a little bit of Sharpie to come off the top, now I want to get all of the Sharpie off except for the little stripe on the top. So the Sharpie is a really good way to make sure that you don't accidentally nick a fret and make it too low, and then you'll have to start the whole process all over again. So I went down the fingerboard and did every single fret like this with a 300 grit file, and then right before I shaped it, I went over the bevels again with the leveling file just to get a really nice 45 degrees down the ends. And then I grabbed a fret dressing file, which is like a very, very tiny file basically, and carefully rounded over every single fret end. And so you want this to be nice and smooth, so as a player slides their hand up and down the neck, they're not gonna cut themselves or even feel the frets. And then when I was done dressing the ends, I grabbed little pieces of sandpaper and wrapped them around my Z file and basically worked my way up from the 300 grit that the file was all the way to 1000 grit, and that brought a lot of shine and polish to those frets. The frets, by the way, are stainless steel, so all in, my guesstimate is that I probably spent 7 or 8 hours on just the frets. And with the neck pretty much done, it was time to move on to finishing both pieces. So I gave both of them a final sanding up to about 320, and then to finish the neck, I actually just attached a little piece of scrap wood to the neck pocket and set it up in my jaws vise. Per the suggestion of one of my luthier friends, I actually opted for a new finish on this one, and I used spray-on shellac. And I've been sleeping on this, you guys. Like, it's such a good finish, and what I really liked about it is that it was all natural, so it's basically just made out of bug excrement, which means that you can spray it outside guilt-free. It's not toxic at all. I think it's even food safe. Not that I'm like licking my base. That would be weird. But it also, each layer dissolves into the previous layer, so you don't actually need to sand between layers to get a really nice bond. I did sand between at least a couple of my coats because I wanted to get a smoother and smoother finish. But yeah, it was so easy. In total for the body, I did I think 5 coats, and I sanded after the first coat and before the last coat, and that's it. Right before finishing the neck, I wiped down the ebony really, really well and then gave all of the maple a really good sanding. A lot of ebony dust was kind of slowly working its way into the maple and tarnishing the color. So sanding it all out right before I finished it was kind of like the move here. So I went in, smoothed everything out, and then I was ready to shellac the neck as well. Oh, and I've masking taped off the fretboard because only the maple is going to get this hard finish. The fretboard will get like a soft beeswaxy oil finish to it, and that is just like nice for playability. And man, look at those tiger stripes! Ah! And now is the scariest part of any kind of electric instrument. It's when you take your beautiful bass and potentially put holes in all the wrong places. So this one from the bridge to the cavity was pretty easy, but then from the cavity to the 2 pickups was incredibly frightening, to say the least. And also, this is the part of the build where I realized I'm never going to build another instrument out of Purple Heart again. It is so hard to get all the teeny little screws into. I think if I was going to do it again, I would put like machine screw inserts in and then just use machine screws because it was eating drill bits and it was eating screws and just miserable. So as a result, I'm actually going to fast forward through most of it because I don't want to talk about it. It was such a bad day. If you are interested in the hardware that I used, though, I used Golden Age pickups, a Hipshot bridge. All of that stuff is linked down in the description below, and those are affiliate links, by the way. Huge thank you to StuMac for providing me with all of the tools and all of the hardware for this project.
Take off the tape.
I'm so tired that there's no joy in this anymore. Hoya!
Dang.
Alright, I'm done. I'm going home. But alas, I could not go home because my base was still nutless. So goes the ways of the base. Now, this nut I'm making is made out of actual bone. They used to be made out of ivory. However, ivory looks a whole lot better still attached to the elephant. So please don't use ivory for things because obviously it's like super damaging to an endangered species. Anyway, this piece comes a little bit oversized and you just have to like sand it down to shape until it's a really tight fit in that nut slot. And then I used half a pencil to mark where the fret hits, like what the height of the fret is, and then I sanded to about double that. Once I was happy with the fit, I put 2 tiny dabs of CA glue in the slot just to hold it in, like for sure, and gently hammered my nut in. Then using a string spacing rule, I marked out where each of the string slots need to be, and then used a fretting saw to start the cuts. And then I worked my way up with nut files, but I think I lost that footage because this is all I got. Sorry. And then it was just time to set it up. So I strung it up, and I did actually take it to a guy named Doug Graham at Ballona Creek Lutherie, who was a super awesome luthier, and he helped me like check intonation and pick up heights and stuff. And I figured, you know, at some point a real luthier should look at it.
Xyla, you really nailed this bass. It's really interesting. So you built this without never having held a bass before?
Yeah.
That's pretty sick. I mean, this is really good. Like the neck feels really good. It feels like it's in between a P bass and a jazz bass.
That was very intentional. Slow-mo?
Please like and subscribe. Hashtag content.
Slap that subscribe button.
Gross. Cut.
If you watch this video with your family and you're feeling super inspired to try an instrument of your own, but this is a little bit intimidating for you, let me recommend the sponsor of today's video, which is KiwiCo. KiwiCo creates hands-on STEAM education kits for kids of all ages, including this really fun ukulele kit. Those of you who've been watching my channel for a while, you've maybe noticed that I've filmed most of my sponsor segments in my shop, but I actually decided to come and film this on my coffee table in my living room because everything you need for a KiwiCo kit comes in the box, so you don't need my fancy shop for that. One of the best things I think that KiwiCo teaches kids is creative confidence. It's confidence in your hands and what they can create, and that you can make whatever your mind thinks of. Anyway, click the link in the description below for 50% off your first order, or go to kiwico.com/Xyla Foxlin. I can't talk and play at the same time. That's proof that I play a single note instrument that doesn't involve singing. Bye!
That's not what the internet wants. YouTube doesn't like.
That was so good.
Yeah.